Hi, we're going to view from here. I'm Matt Driskill, live, sort of, in Singapore. That's right, we made the big move from Hong Kong a long time ago, and we're now broadcasting live from Singapore. Today we are continuing the FCC Speaker Series. We've got Mr. Paul Beckett. He's the Asia editor of the Wall Street Journal. His topic today, the New Delhi rape tragedy, call for reform in India. A little bit more about him in just a minute. Many of you know the FCC in Hong Kong. Many of you know it's a key stop on the itineraries of the most well-known people in the world who happen to be passing through the city. The View from Here is pleased to announce we've got the complete set of speeches dating all the way back to 2007, more than the club itself has, and we're uploading each and every speech from 2013 as fast as we can. Speakers and topics in the series include people like Mia Farrow, famous actress, outspoken activist on China and Darfur. We've got Bill Clinton in conversation with Lee Kuan Yew, the founder of modern-day Singapore, the soft rock capital of the world. And we've got people like Chris Patton, the last governor of Hong Kong before it was handed back to China. We've also got people like comedian, author Michael Palin of Monty Python fame, and we've got many, many more. Check back frequently on The View from Here to get the latest podcast. Don't forget, you can also log on to iTunes and subscribe to The View from Here, and that way you won't miss a key speech. Just go to the iTunes store, do a search for me, Matt Driskill, or The View from Here, and subscribe, and that way each and every speech should be downloaded straight to your iPod, your iPhone, or your iPad. A little bit more about today's offering. According to the propaganda I've been handed, the topic today, the New Delhi rape tragedy, call for reform in India. The speaker, Mr. Paul Beckett, he's the Asia editor of the Wall Street Journal. In December 2012, reports of the gang rape of a young woman in India's capital generated headlines around the world, which it indeed did. The horrific incident and the subsequent death of the woman turned eyes toward the underbelly of the world's second most populous nation, drawing attention to the exploitation and abuse that many Indian women face on a daily basis. More broadly, the case generated widespread debate on the position of women in Indian society. Mr. Beckett discusses what can be done to tackle the issue of crimes against women in India and touch on the roles and responsibilities of the media, government, and NGOs in raising this subject in the public arena. He's followed the case closely. He's the co-author of Crimes Against Women, Three Tragedies, and the Call for Reform in India, which is a new ebook with in-depth coverage of 3 headline-generating crimes against women in the past 18 months, as well as a series of recommendations that could lead to the change in society. As I said, Paul Beckett, he's the Asia editor of the Wall Street Journal. He's in charge of the paper's print and digital editorial operations. He moved to Hong Kong in 2013 after 6 years as South Asia editor based in New Delhi. Mr. Beckett and the Wall Street Journal's India Bureau received the Overseas Press Club Award for their India coverage in 2008. Well, that's a view from here. That's it for me, Matt Driskill. Stay tuned. The topic, the New Delhi rape tragedy, call for reform in India. Speaker, Mr. Paul Beckett, Asia editor of the Wall Street Journal. He is next.
Coming back from summer break, having an event today, and it's fantastic to see such a good turnout. Just a quick few housekeeping notes before we get started. Please make sure your mobile phones are switched to silence before we get going. And also, in terms of upcoming events, we will definitely get the wheel rolling over the next few weeks. And the next one, for all the women in the room, because there are a lot of them today, which is fantastic, we will have a breakfast on the morning of September 18th, which would discuss women in the media. We'll have some senior women in the media talking about their careers and what it's like to rise to the top in the field of journalism in Asia. So we hope to see many men and women attend a breakfast event. Now, on to the event of the day. It's my pleasure to introduce Paul Beckett, who is the Asia editor of the Wall Street Journal. He's recently come to Hong Kong after 6 years of working in Delhi. He is an expert on India. I asked him how he got to India, and he said, well, things were going like this, and it seemed like the place to go at the time from London. But obviously, he's seen a lot over his time there. Interestingly, from an outsider's perspective, India seems like it's in a bit of a hole right now. The economy is sliding on what seems like a daily basis. And then this story of a gang rape in India really taking over headlines for a time last year. And just last week, another big story about the rape of a journalist in India as well. So I will leave it to Paul to tell us what this is all about and whether there is reform to be had in this area. My pleasure to introduce Paul.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much. Thanks, Tara, for the introduction. Thank you to the FCC for having me, and thank you all for coming. I should really caveat this talk before we delve into what are really very depressing topics, to say that I love India. We were there for 6 years, about double the length of a normal posting. It's a country that was almost indescribably unique in its beauty, in its hospitality, in its charm, and it was a very challenging place to live and report. One of those challenges, of course, was trying to avoid generalizations. That's true anywhere, but especially in a country where the adage runs that whatever is true in India, its opposite is also true. And that's really true. That said, the topic that we're going to talk about today is one that, from the point of view of India's national consciousness and as a subject of media scrutiny, has been hiding in plain sight for decades. It took the rape of a young woman in the center of the nation's capital just before Christmas for crimes against women to be thrust into the forefront of Indian public discourse and to change the way that the world now views India. I'd like to look today at why this single event captured so much attention inside and outside India, and we'll look at the reasons at why India has become a violent place for so many women, and finally we'll talk about what can be done to improve that situation. So what was it about this incident that gave it such resonance? I think on one level it was simply because it was the stuff of nightmares or horror movies. The young woman, her name has not been released, embodied what was bright and hopeful about India. She was the first in her family to go to college. She was a daughter treated by an admirable and loving father with an ambition that is often only reserved for sons. She was a sister who tutored and set lofty goals for her younger brother. She studied physiotherapy while working at a call center at night, dealing with mortgage holders in Canada, and she was independent. And then one evening, she went to a mall to see Life of Pi. She and her male friend, they got on a bus home, lured on by a teenager who was described later as having a sing-song voice. Once on board, the only other passengers turned out to be determined assailants, drunk and itching for a fight. The lights were turned off. The bus drove around the center of one of the world's biggest cities as she was raped with a metal rod, and he was badly beaten. About an hour later, the young couple was thrown naked and bloodied onto the side of a highway. Passers-by ignored them until finally someone stopped. About a week later, the young woman died of her injuries. This was, by any standards, an exceptionally brutal attack. But another reason it carried such weight and resonance was it was not an exception to how women, broadly speaking, are often treated in India. Either because they have direct experience with sexual violence of varying degrees of severity, or because they live with the threat of it all the time. They also live with a system of public order and criminal justice where crimes and threats are met with, at best, official apathy and at worst, connivance. The rape was, at the same time, both a unique case in its shocking details, but an everyday occurrence in what it typified, the commonplace violence against India's women. Those are the themes that we looked at in a book that we published recently. In fact, the two other stories that we chronicle there in depth happened before the Delhi rape. The first story looks at the murder of a Catholic nun, Sister Valsa John Malamal. She was an anti-mining activist in the eastern Indian state of Jharkhand, One of the reasons police say that she was killed was that Sister Valsa had advised a young woman in her village to launch a complaint against a local boy who had allegedly raped her. Instead, the police tried to negotiate a settlement between the girl's family and the boy's family and refused to register a case. The day before Sister Valsa and the girl were going to complain to a local official who oversaw the police department, Sister Valsa was hacked to pieces by a mob of men that allegedly included the rapist. The second story looks at the plight of a woman who was lured into leaving her village in eastern India for Delhi on the promise of a new life away from her abusive husband. She left home with her 3 children only to find that she'd been duped into a prostitution racket. What follows would honestly make Charles Dickens accusers of contriving a plot that was too far-fetched to be believed. But it was crimes like these and countless others that gave the horrendous incident in December in Delhi, which of course could have happened anywhere in the world. Such great potency. It resonated inside and outside India in different ways. Outside of India, I think it was, and indirectly still is, defining how the world sees the country. In fact, it is contradicting how the world has seen India after decades of largely empathetic storylines. Think of things that modern India is celebrated for worldwide. Its democracy, its peaceful independent movement, its software and engineering skills, its movies, its dance, its food, yoga. It's a font of several major religions. India has definitely benefited from being not China, from being not Pakistan, in many Western eyes. Even the terrible things, poverty, natural disasters, the extraordinarily high death toll for seemingly avoidable calamities, evoke sympathy, not disgust. This case changed that, and it continues to set the reputational agenda because atrocities continue to happen. Just last week, a young photojournalist accompanied by a male colleague that Tara referenced was gang raped in Mumbai, where she was shooting photographs at 6 in the evening. You may have seen a recent CNN eye report by an American student chronicling her experience of sexual harassment in India. It is the most viewed eye report on CNN ever. These events and the reporting of them will alter the worldview of India in bad ways for a very long time. Within India, the Delhi rape gave a microphone to those who have either suffered in this environment or been appalled by it. In the days following the event, thousands took to the streets in protest against what they viewed as the government's indifference to women's security. They were met with water cannons. What was perhaps even more remarkable was the number of women who spoke up about or wrote about their own experiences after the widespread publicity that the Delhi rape had garnered. These were women with an articulateness to write or speak movingly about major traumas in their lives, and to have the savvy to know how to get their accounts broadcast or published. Middle-class women, professional women in the nation's largest cities. When we at the Journal were looking for ways to take this story forward, and we started asking around, almost every woman we asked had a story. A relative, a work situation, being on location to report or shoot, a male school teacher, a great litany of abuse and harassment that was shocking in its pervasiveness. Just think how many women then that would apply to if it were extrapolated across a country of 1.2 billion people. One of the big questions, of course, is why is India like this? If there's one simple answer, and lots of people have tried to provide one, then it would also be easy to fix. I don't think there is. Everyone will draw their different conclusions. But let me run through some of the causes that we think have created this toxic combination. Then we'll look briefly at what might be done about it. Tradition. India had a revolution of sorts in throwing out the British in 1947. But it has not had a social revolution that fundamentally altered people's relationships to each other. As a result, deeply held conservative beliefs about the closeted, prescribed role of women in society that were set centuries ago remain widespread. This is more prevalent in rural India, but it persists in urban India too. It is more tied to communities than it is to location, and it covers all classes and castes. Among those conservative beliefs, and varying among different communities, is a parental desire for boys. Women traditionally leave home when they're married. Boys stay at home, and a son's wife moves in to serve her parents-in-law. This not only has an impact on the relation between the sexes, it also has made for a very skewed sex ratio as parents rid themselves of unborn girls. This has led to a dramatic shortage of women in some areas. In Rajasthan, one of India's most popular tourist destinations, there are 926 women for every 1,000 men. For girls under 6, there are 883 girls for every 1,000 boys, a gap that has actually widened in the last 10 years. That combination of a shortage of men and a conservative society has meant, in simple terms, that men don't meet women. There are very few opportunities for women and men to be together, alone, away from their family's gaze. They are alienated from one another, and that's a distance that can stoke aggression. India's economic growth also has played an unwitting role in all of this. It's created a generation of women who are now working outside the house, in offices, studying at colleges, making gains in a society that are threatening to some men who have not pursued opportunity with the same diligence. In one piece in the book, we look at a railway platform in West Bengal, in eastern India, where women pass daily on their commutes. What that commute has become is a gauntlet of harassment that sometimes turns into something much worse. This daily scene on the station platform plays out within yards of a police station, and yet it proceeds unchecked. That's another major contributor to this sinister environment, the appalling state of India's public order and governance. Simply put, the law doesn't have the upper hand. The police are underfunded, understaffed, and corrupt. India has one of the lowest police-to-population ratios in the world, and police have an appalling record of taking sexual crimes seriously. Assailants can act with near impunity. So a vicious circle is created. Not only are women targets, but there is little incentive for them to report crimes that might lead to greater awareness, that in turn might lead to effective action or deterrence. Instead, a woman who is raped may well be hushed up by her family to protect her honor and to protect her marriageable status. And it's all with an assumption, spoken or unspoken, that had she not left the house, this might not have happened. Except, of course, that it might have. Marital rape, also a major problem in India, that authorities, including judges, are very loath to take seriously. So, where do we go from here? After the Delhi rape, the government led a reform push centered around strengthening laws against sexual assault. Of course, those measures were welcome. Yet changing the law is hardly the answer. It's the implementation of existing law that has been the problem. Unfortunately, that effort suffers from the same dysfunction in the body politic, bumbling leadership, rampant corruption, a very narrow sense of the common well-being that is now cratering India's economy and leaving hundreds of millions of people mired in poverty. So I wouldn't hold out much hope that India's politicians or bureaucrats will take any meaningful initiative on their own to address the problems of crimes against women anytime soon. Holding them more accountable at the ballot box, of course, would be a fine thing. But there's little evidence, even as India approaches a national election, that this is being seen as a hot electoral issue. NGOs are working hard to make a difference, but women's security is just one of a vast list of problems that NGOs have to tackle in India. And there is not, broadly speaking, a wide network of financial support for groups that are trying to address these issues. India's media, especially its rambunctious television channels, have been impressive in highlighting this issue and keeping pressure on the body politic. It's a hugely important role, one where politicians are put in the spotlight and embarrassed when they speak or act in ways that diminish the seriousness of this issue or even perpetuate the problem. This happened most famously with the president's own son, himself a member of parliament, when he compared the protesters in Delhi after the Delhi rape to beaten up cars. It was, frankly, wonderful to watch him squirm. This can all help push the change that is really required, which is a change in the culture itself. Liberation from the deeply chauvinist attitudes that prevail in many parts of the country. Those attitudes currently perpetuate practices. Take the payment of dowry, where a bride's family is expected to enrich a groom's family in return for marriage. That practice has by no means diminished in an era of strong economic growth. The price has just gone up. To change that culture will require nothing less than a revolution in the fundamental relationship between women and men. It will take more women demanding their rights, getting a willing hearing. It will take more women standing up to the chauvinism of many Indian men and being heard when they yell that they won't take it anymore. It will take more women walking on the streets and going out at night, not retreating to behind their house walls out of fear of what might happen if they venture outside. It will take families to say no more when a relative assaults a family member or sexually abuses a girl in the household. And it will take, and this is of course the most important of all, a dramatic change of attitude among India's men. A change that will require them to adopt a stance towards women that is respectful of their bodies and of their equal standing in society. Changing those attitudes is a very tall order, a generational shift in the giant tumult that is daily life on the subcontinent. But there are signs that there are significant numbers who now demand that change. A culture of protest, especially among the middle class, has rapidly developed in the past few years. It started with the anti-corruption drive of the self-styled Gandhian Anna Hazare. In the words of one Indian friend who took to the streets after the Delhi rape, he taught us how to protest. Now the middle class, spurred on by the media, is demanding better standards and protesting to get it. This was not a protesting class in the past. It's quite the opposite, in fact. And their demonstrable anger about the threats that they face has brought about a big change in how an influential slice of Indian society responds to atrocities. This is a very promising sign. It will pop up in all kinds of ways around all kinds of topics. The next test is whether it can bring about the revolution in gender relations that's needed. Why is this required? India can't thrive if so many of its women feel intimidated when they participate in its development or are threatened when they try to assert their rights. Changing prevailing attitudes will be very tough. Indians who take to the streets now may not be up for a long fight, but for India to be the country that its advocates, myself included, contend it can be, it is a battle that must be engaged. Thank you very much for listening. I appreciate it.
Paul, thanks very much. I'm actually almost too stunned to speak. Everything that you mentioned, I think from outside India, you put it together in a way there's a lot to digest there. We have 20 minutes for Q&A. Please raise your hand. We'll pass a microphone around. Over here.
Hi, Paul. I was hoping you could put this in context of tourism in terms of has tourism really dropped as a result of this? Is that a pressure the government's feeling? And could you also talk about gun laws and whether women can arm themselves? Are there things that women are doing to try in some way to protect themselves?
I think it has to have an impact on tourism. I don't have the numbers, Deb, but just anecdotally, it must have made a difference. I bet you if you canvassed all of your friends and said, were you thinking of going to India last year and are you still thinking of going to India, they might say, yes, it's fine. And then you say, well, is your daughter going to India? And they say, absolutely not. And I think it must have been devastating. But in terms of tourism, it's a relatively small part of India's economy. It's not something that factors in economic policy making. It's not something that factors in political pressure. And so I doubt that a precipitous drop in tourism even would make much of a difference. In terms of guns, it's a remarkably gun-free society. I mean, we lived there for 6 years. We never encountered anyone who owned a gun for anything but hunting. I mean, it was not. It's just they're just not. It's not there. It's very impressive, in fact. Very, very tightly restricted gun culture. People. There's a flourishing industry for basically flintlocks that are made in the countryside, and there's some gangsters. But arms and guns is not a major part of the violence problem. And I've forgotten the last part of your question. I'm sorry. I think there's some. Yes, there are movements for women to collectively protect themselves better. There's organizations. One of our friends there just wrote a book about the Pink Sari Brigade, Amina Fontanella Khan, and it was about a group of women who were standing up against this environment, and impressively so. So there are some of those movements, but I think there's a also dangerous counter movement, which is you just can't, you can't go out, don't go out, or you do things like it seems liberating at the time, but you have a women's only car in the metro. Right? 1 out of 15 cars is women's only car, and everybody says, "Oh, it's brilliant, the women's only cars in the metro." Well, they have them because the other 14 aren't safe, and the more that you pack all the women into one car, the less safe the other 14 become. So there are initiatives like that that I think are well-meaning, but I don't think really address the problem.
We had a question over here.
Hi, Paul. I had two questions, actually. One was that, given that you've lived in India for so many years, I wanted your view on why it's taking the judiciary so long to come out with a verdict in what happened in Delhi. It happened in December, so it's been 8 months and there's been no verdict. And the other is, what do you think really needs to be done to see a deep-rooted change in the mindsets of people towards women?
On the first one, that trial is moving at lightning speed by Indian standards. It's literally in a fast-track court that was set up specially for that case. If they get a verdict out any time before the end of the year, it will be a triumph of Indian criminal justice. So, I mean, there's 30 million cases backed up in the Indian judicial system. It's not, this one is actually moving very quick by those standards. And I expect it in they'll probably have a verdict in the next 2 or 3 weeks. So this one actually is being held up as a showpiece of swiftness and efficiency. And in terms of what can be done to change, I think there's that wonderful book, A Million Mutinies, about India. It's going to take a billion little mutinies to change this. I mean, it's really ultimately it's going to be down to individuals. I don't think, as I tried to suggest, I don't see grand sweeping policy or a sudden shift in how effective the deterrence is going to become or governance is going to become. I think it has to happen pretty much household by household. And that's going to, I mean, there's a lot, as I said, there's a lot of signs that aspects of that are getting better. But it's going to be very, very tough.
We have a question over here, Robin.
Two questions, really. One about the rape itself and one about the changing social environment. Maybe they're related. As you mentioned, this situation has been going on forever in India, and Eve teasing is talked about openly as well. Do you think that because this was a middle-class woman who was so brutally attacked, that's why we in the press were able to latch onto it so easily? Or was it what you mentioned a moment ago about Anna Hazar? I mean, just the fact that the middle class is getting used to protesting again. And the second one is India's in dire economic straits. People say it takes a crisis sometimes for many places, especially India, to move. Are we there yet? And might we see a middle class uprising in outrage over the economy?
On the first, she wasn't middle class, really. She was aspiring middle class. I mean, her father was a day laborer at the airport, made about $5 a day. So she was one of those wonderful stories. She would have been a lead anecdote in a front page story in the Wall Street Journal about the wonderful things that are happening in India in terms of children exceeding their parents' livelihoods and income. I mean, those are the stories we wrote in 2007, right? And she would be absolutely perfect for that. You couldn't have found a better example. Rags to riches, all the rest. I mean, it's still very modest. I think the thing that made the difference was the barbarity of it and the fact that it happened in middle-class places. So, she'd gone to the movie, gone to a Western movie, Oscar-winning movie, at a huge mall that was in the center of Delhi, and the route that the bus took, I mean, it goes past the diplomatic enclave, and then it goes out to the road to the airport. I mean, she was dumped near the airport. I mean, dumped in anybody who knows Delhi, has ever traveled in Delhi, knows exactly where that bus went. And I think that's what made it particularly dramatic, because these are buses. They were quasi-legal buses. Right? It wasn't the equivalent of the Delhi public transport, but they were licensed. Of course, that system's complete shambles, but they were licensed. They knew who the bus driver, knew who owned it, and all the rest of it. And the guy who was the bus, one of the suspects who's since killed himself, was the regular driver of that bus. So that he had the bus. And so I think that's what really freaked people out. And then TV got onto it, and look, from a journalistic perspective, you can't, it was dreadfully sad, but she was raped, and that got a lot of attention. And then she was in the hospital. And then she was moved to Singapore. There's a big question. Okay, did she move to Singapore because the treatment's better, or was she moved to Singapore because the Delhi government didn't want to deal with the flak, right? She gets to Singapore, and then it's death watch. It was just a horrendous 8 or 9 days. And then there was protests. And then the protesters got water cannoned and beaten up. I mean, you can't handle it worse than that from a public order, public, handling a crisis point of view. You just can't. And I think all of those steps really seared it into people's imagination. And that was the most read story on the WallStreetJournal.com for a long period of time, mostly from outside of India. It just shocked people. In terms of a crisis, India's economy certainly looks like it's going to be in a crisis. My impression is that I've never seen the middle class get really angry about the economy, because for the most part they're doing much, much better than everybody else. Right? The things that they've got angry about recently has been the anti-corruption drive that Anna Hazare started, and that fizzled. But what it taught people was to say, you know what, screw it, let's get in the car, let's go up to the protest grounds and let's go out there and shout about it. People who never would have done it before. So no, I don't think the economy will I'd be very surprised if the economy gets people out in the street. Will it get bad enough that the government, for all its incompetence, has to act? Perhaps, but we've been going that way for a long time and they haven't got anything done. I mean, this last session of Parliament was a disaster. Absolute disaster. Nothing got done. And meanwhile, the currency tanks and India gets put in, it's not brick anymore, it's basket case. So I think that's, I don't know, perhaps I'm a little cynical about the confidence of the Indian government to handle these things. I hope there's nobody here from the Indian government. Sorry.
Paul, just like to hear your views on what you think the role and responsibility of the local media is, and whether they've embraced the responsibility to bring about change, or you think this is more likely to bring more changes likely to be brought about by social media as a result of this?
I think both are hugely important. I wouldn't say. I think the English language media, to be honest, that's what we followed most closely, embraced this issue and got really mad about it. And it was impressive. There's a turning point in my experience of the English language media's feistiness in India, and it was around the Commonwealth Games. And up until 2010, everybody just thought, oh, Commonwealth Games, it's going to be rah-rah India, here we go, global city, everything's on the up and up. And the Commonwealth Games was such a shambles in its organization. The event itself went off fine. Such a shambles in its organization that you saw the Indian media turn on the government and turn on public officials. And they've kept that up ever since in many impressive ways. And I think this would not have had nearly the resonance that it would have if it hadn't been top news on 24-hour TV channels and front page of the papers every day for probably, I'm guessing, at least 2 weeks. This one case, you know, and it spawned all kinds of spin-offs, and I think the Indian media is actually, I'm pretty mixed on it overall, but I think in this case they really served a valuable function, and I think social media has, but in a population where you have, I think it's 7% internet penetration. I mean, it's tiny. So on the assumption that you need connectivity to be on social media, it's a bit of an echo chamber. Yes, ma'am.
We had a question over here.
Hi, Paul. Thank you for your speech. I was really touched and shocked. I know many might focus on this issue from a social scale. I personally might look at it from an individual's perspective or a family's. Now, you've mentioned that a lot of women tend to remain silent after their rape. I'm just wondering what their husband's reaction might be after the rape, or how their attitudes change towards their wives. Thank you.
It's a good question, to be honest. I don't know the answer. I don't know. We haven't talked to husbands of rape victims. I think it's a good point. I think you see some very brave instances where, and people were writing about this after the Delhi rape, where women would come out and say, "My honor is just fine, thank you very much. It's my body that was raped, it wasn't my honor that was taken." You know, and families that support that. But that was rare enough to be printed in the paper. You know, I mean, that was rare enough to be a point of view that people thought was valuable in sharing to try and inspire other people and get out of that cycle of in some way, subtle and not so subtle, putting the blame on the woman. And that's still very prevalent.
Over here.
Hi, Paul. Emily from Time.
Hey, how are you?
I'm wondering what you learned as an editor about the way that the press can write about sexual assault in a way that's respectful to the survivors, and does the press and the public have a right to know about people's experiences of rape? I mean, and how did you balance those concerns as an editor?
Great question. We even using the term, I think we went back and forth a bit between victim and survivor, and I don't think that's a settled question. What's the most respectful, proper term to use? I mean, it's that basic. In terms of the rest of it, yes, we all knew details that we never published because you just hit the wall of journalistic value and good taste. And so you just try and make it as, you want it to be shocking. It is shocking. I mean, why are we pretending it's not shocking? Right? But you also have to just go up, you have to draw the line at some point and say that that's shocking enough to stop there. And I think we did that, and we tried to do that. And we also tried to, a lot of what we did was less about the details and more about the context. I think the most moving story, and I think, you know, it's not often that the Wall Street Journal makes you cry, but one of the most moving stories we did was we got very, very good access to the boy who was with her on the bus. And he told us their story. And it's a love story. And a lot of people afterwards said, you know, you guys are really violating their privacy and everything else. Well, he told us. He felt it was important. We felt it was important for people to know, so that we couldn't name her, so we thought it was important at least to show the life that she led, show the relationship she had with this guy, show what this guy had gone through as well. And it's a very moving story, but, you know, some people didn't like it. And Not much we can do about it. It conformed to our definition of something that was good storytelling without being bad taste.
Question over here.
Back to media. You talked about the English media. Was there a difference between the English media, the Hindi media, and regional media in their covering of the rape and in general of such cases?
I think this one transcended both in terms of its reporting. I think it was very widely publicized in regional media as well. I think delving into some of the issues would have been done more on the English language side. You know, I think on the English language side there was a lot more discussion, opinion, debate, panels on television. I don't think it had the same dominance in regional media that it had in the English language, in the Delhi-centric English language media. You know, I'm talking NTTV, Times Now, CNN, IBN. They were the ones that were really driving it, and I feel like it certainly wasn't a complete split, but I do think it got more attention in the English media. Yeah.
One more over here, please.
So one of the other horrific type of assaults on women is acid attacks, which I thought was only prevalent in Pakistan. I didn't realize until a few weeks ago how prevalent it was in India. I mean, is that just because these horrific attacks for women who pushed away advances from men and had their faces burnt off with acid, is that something that's just getting pressed now, or is it something that's increasing in prevalence, or what's going on there?
I think it's a good question. I suspect it's a bit of both. I suspect it is getting worse because it occurs to people when it's reported. And I think there is an element of this. I think that it's the more it's written about, to some degree, it gives people's ideas of things that they can do. That said, I don't think it was ever a case of this is something that happens in Pakistan, doesn't happen in India. I think I'm sure it's something that's been happening there for a long, long time.
A final question, Paul, if I may, is as journalists, when we write and publish stories, we ask, why do we care? Why does our audience care about this story? And this one took the world. WallStreetJournal.com, overseas, everywhere people were interested in this story. Does that suggest that it's a turning point for women in India, or for the awareness of what's happening? And why was this one the turning point?
I think it's only a turning point for how people outside of India view India. And I don't think the fact that it had huge global resonance makes the slightest bit of difference in India. It has to have resonance in India to matter. And I think this one within India had resonance just for the reasons that we talked about. That it was startling, and it made people just wake up and say, "This is awful."
But every rape is startling and awful. So
I think
is there timing associated with it?
This was in the middle class area in the center of the capital. Got picked up very quickly by TV, and it ran. It was a story that ran for more than 2 weeks. Top billing for more than 2 weeks because it was such a tragedy. I don't mean to, but that's what I think seared it into people's imagination. Oh, don't get me wrong. It's not like something will boil up like the Mumbai case, and people get angry about it again. But I was in New York in June, and I had dinner with a friend there, an Indian friend there, and I said, "So is everybody still talking about the Delhi rape case?" Because this had been something that we covered so intensively until I left. And I said, "What?" I said, the Delhi rape case in December. I said, "No. Like it's moved on. It's moved on." So I don't, I think it's going to take more. Then Mumbai happens and it comes back. But for it actually to be dramatic change, and for me to go back or anyone here to go there in 2 years and say it's really nothing like they talked about.
I think we'll leave it on that sobering note. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you all for
Paul
listening.
Beckett. Thank you. And before I I forget we have a small gift from the FCC to thank you for coming today and to welcome you to